Morning, everybody. Welcome to the Jazz Journal. This is our first feature piece for the journal. There's going to be a lot of small little album reviews, some guest articles, but this is going to be a feature piece in each issue. And today's issue, we're going to cover the New York piano players. And as I was doing and learning this history of jazz, it became very clear to me the powerful urban black neighborhoods that were producing the great jazz musicians. Detroit comes to mind right off the bat. Philly had a really strong presence. Chicago has a host of great players. Pittsburgh's home to a lot of great players. What continuously surprised me as I was digging through the horn players and all these jazz greats, how rare any of these guys seem to be from New York originally. And I was a little taken aback by that because there was a big black population there, and certainly it was the center of the jazz universe. It would only seem to make sense that Harlem and Brooklyn were producing a lot of great jazz players. And of course, Sonny Rollins is the great exception, but sometimes the exception proves the rule. And when you go down the list of all the great horn players especially, it's a pretty short list of guys that are New York based, New York born. Ernie Henry comes to mind, but the gap from Sonny Rollins to Ernie Henry is pretty big. And as I was doing my biographies on my channel, a shocking revelation kept happening to me. The great piano players of jazz, an absurd number of them are New York born. And at first I thought it was a coincidence. I'm like, oh, Monk's from here, that's cool, yeah, so Monk and Rollins. Oh, Bud Powell's from here too. Oh, Wynton Kelly, weird. You know, Elmo Hope, interesting. Kenny Drew, okay, what's going on? And it led me to doing some research. And I am sure I missed some guys. And my list really only covers 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. So who are the guys on piano that are New York born from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? Please tell me. I'd be curious to know, to add them to this list. But what I have come up with is a list of 15 premier names in jazz that were New York born. And we're not including guys like Art Tatum, who moved there and lived there forever and were fixtures in New York. He was in Chicago and LA too. And Tatum's, I think he's from Pittsburgh if I recall, along with Jamal and Errol Garner. So Pittsburgh has some great players as well. But the New York piano player. And one of the first things that came to my mind was the city itself. If you take the grid of Manhattan from 14th Street up to 110th Street at the top of the park, and you lay it on its side, it's almost like the organization of the piano keys. Manhattan has this kind of grid to it, that section of from above the Village through Midtown up into Harlem. It's just this laid out grid that's very rigid and striated, and you can kind of almost play the keys of New York. And it's a visual thing, but New York does have this grid to it, this kind of a sensibility to it, that in order to maneuver and know your way around, you have to get to know your streets and your avenues. And it was just kind of an interesting thing as I looked at it, because the city itself has a complexity and a harmony to it that the piano can relate to. What you get on 56th Street might be different from 61st Street, and it'll be different from 78th Street on the east side. See what I'm saying? And so the city has this dissonance at times. It has a rhythm and an energy and a pulse to it at times. There's a broadness of the experience that a horn player might be limited in projecting and expressing. But because a piano can play chords and touch on 3, 4, 5, 6 avenues at once. It allows for a certain kind of color to be done and a relationship to the city itself. The city is a vibrant, complex place, New York, unto itself. There's no other place like New York. And it's almost as if growing up there as a jazz player, only the piano connected and drove their sensibilities. It allowed them to comment on a broader spectrum than simply playing a trumpet would. I also deducted that New York is a very expensive place to play. And the guys who get the most work are piano players. They record solo, they record in duets and trios, they record in quartets and quintets, and they record in swing bands. So if you work as a piano player, you're probably going to get a lot of work compared to a guy who plays timpani, the harp, or even the trombone. The piano is a very ubiquitous thing in jazz. Now, aside from recording sessions, getting live work, pianos are like the only instrument that consistently book solo gigs. I got bills to pay. I'm gonna go play at such and such cafe, venue, club, whatever, by myself. I got a residency there, and I can get to keep all the money for myself. I don't got to split it with 3 horn players and a drummer. Or I could be in a trio setting and we'll split the money 3 ways. And so there's an economic sense that probably drove some of these guys to be piano players. Most musicians of this era learn multiple instruments. And these guys all settled on the piano, and they're all some of the great orchestrators of this music. If you take the body of work that these 15 guys are contributing to, it's a gigantic slice of the jazz pie. It's massive. And in so many ways, the intricacy of New York, the input of new ideas, new cultures, new philosophies, impacts your mindset. You become comfortable with all these different ways of living and thinking. You don't think twice about different. And it's that kind of thinking that allows a Monk and a Powell to do things that nobody had thought of doing before. New York says, we do that all the time. So a New Yorker is going to say, I can do that anytime I want to. And so when you really start looking at this group, you got to kind of go back and start at the beginning. And again, I'm probably missing guys. I didn't have time to dig super deep. And a lot of these guys came up in episodes I did. I did a Monk episode, I did a Powell episode, I did a Wynton Kelly episode. I've done episodes on Elmo Hope and Herbie Nichols. And it just kept coming up like, oh, New Yorker. Bill Evans, oh, New Yorker. He was born in New Jersey, outside of New York. Horace Silver was born in Connecticut, just outside of New York. These are New York people. So we're going to start back in the 20s with James P. Johnson. And James P. Johnson, along with the great Fats Waller and Willie the Lion Smith, these 3 guys held down the brothels, the bars, the house parties, the basement clubs of New York for a long time. And it's into this milieu that a guy like Art Tatum comes along and brings his innovations. But stride, barrel house piano, chomping left hands, rolling right hands, incredible degrees of virtuosity. What happened with these great 3 New York players led to a lot of the great cutting contests. Oh, Willie the Lion Smith's going to be here. Let's see if I can outplay him. Good luck. Oh, Fats Waller's going to be there tonight. Let me see if I can outduke him. And these guys were all personalities on top of virtuosity. And they're all very quintessential New York. Waller, to me, is my favorite of the bunch. I love Fats Waller and his tongue-in-cheek, almost comic approach to life. He just has a real joy for living and would probably be a fun guy to drink some cognac with. He'd be a fun guy to kick back a bottle of whiskey with. And you'd probably get yourself into some mischief, but trust me when I say, we ain't misbehaving. No siree. James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, Glenn the Lion Smith, all three of them are incredible players. All three of them have very strong New York lineage. And from my understanding, they all kind of were friends and respected each other and battled with each other on a fairly regular basis. So, out of this cutting school, the New York piano lineage springs forth. This is the great Willie the Lion Smith. Now, these guys are all going to have recorded during the '78 era, of course. So none of this is going to be like vintage LP stuff, even though this one's probably from the '60s, I'm guessing, on the mainstream label. These guys probably don't get enough love today in jazz circles, but that's just the nature of this business. Now, from Cut Bank, New Jersey, comes along one of the great piano players that doesn't really get heralded enough. And I've been talking about it more, and my friend Jean-Michel speaks often about how great a piano player Count Basie was. And how his reduction of his playing was a large innovation. Before James Brown reduced soul to the funk and minimalized it, Count Basie's playing only the notes necessary. He doesn't need to have, and he's capable of long fills and virtuosity, but he's more intent on creating a groove and a pocket, and let's get this rhythm section tight so that my horn players can swing their asses off. So Count Basie is kind of that next innovation of the New York piano player. You got the virtuosity and personality of those first three, then you got the swing and spatial openness of Basie's composition and playing. Very huge steps in the lineage of the great New York piano players. Followed shortly by Mr. Monk. And Monk propels us directly into the modern era. He borrows greatly from Basie's minimalism. Basie could play that right there. Basie is going to play only the notes essential. And in some ways, Basie reduces the stride players like Monk reduces Parker's bebop. And reduction's good for the listener. That space gives us time to find shape. And shape creates pattern, and pattern creates discomfort in our ears and allows us to tap a foot. And Monk has the avant-garde edges bleeding out of him at all times. He's the first alternative musician in the modern sense. And for me, all alternative music owes a debt to the sacrifice Monk is willing to make, saying, I am going to take what I was given and I'm going to almost disrespect it by chopping it up. And the critics didn't get it at first. You know, Monk battled with the critics and with the club owners and wasn't well received. And his prestige and his Blue Note stuff has since ascended into royalty, but it certainly wasn't well received when it came out in the early 50s. It was really when Monk goes to Riverside in '55 with Bill Grauer and Keep News where Monk finds his audience and the critics start to get this man's left turns. And his Riverside output leads to a lot of critical acclaim, and then eventually goes to Columbia and gets a lot of the fame that Columbia would bring you. But Monk is that next step in the New York piano lineage. And of course, Monk is directly linked to guys like Bud Powell. They were close friends. One second. And a lot of Monk's innovation in playing Powell takes that and informs Monk of his ideas. And Monk and Powell kind of crossbreed each other, along with Elmo Hope. You know, these guys and all the great piano players coming after this, it's like they all seem to get to New York and eventually meet Monk. And that's partly because the scene was happening at Minton's. And so you couldn't be a jazz player trying to be up and coming and not eventually hear about what was going down up there. And if you went up there, Monk was going to be one of the seminal figures that you approached. And being a New York piano player, of course you're going to befriend the piano player at the head of this new music. And so Monk, Powell, they're all very influential on this entire next generation. Horace Silver comes from Connecticut, just outside of Westchester, if I remember right, just on the other side of the border there. Not far from Hell's Gate and all the great bridges of New York and Long Island Sound, that whole area. Horace Silver is taking the reduction of Monk and the space and the funk of Basie. And Silver is one of the great players that defines the modern era. The space, the hammering out and chopping down some lines that are going to be incredibly locked in with the percussion, and giving my horns the space to emote and express without interference. And so he's a direct descendant of Basie and the Monk Powell lineage. And of course, he and Blakey kind of codify the hard bop sound, which is that returning to rhythm, that returning to the head of the piece, that remembering of melody. And a guy like Silver reinstates melody with the groove of Basie. And so Silver is an incredibly important guy. And being in the New York sphere, apparently being a piano player just makes sense. Horace leads a lot of great sessions throughout the 60s, and he's a guy that's going to get his own episode in the near future. Wynton Kelly, another guy who everyone praised, including Miles Davis, for his spatial arranging. How hard he swings. How well he could graft together disparate sounds and different ideas, and yet all was put it out there in a presentation that was going to swing hard. And he's another child of New York. The organizational demands of functioning in New York City, I think it just cross-references to the piano in a real simplistic kind of way. New York requires a certain degree of organization just to get around it. Just to know what subway takes you where. To know what bus to jump on. to know what street and avenue you need to take to get there most efficiently. I think the grid of New York is this virtual piano, and it makes the piano make sense to these guys on some form of different level. Elmo Hope. Elmo Hope's a guy that swings hard. He had friendships with both Powell and Thelonious Monk. And this is a fairly big ensemble here, and to me his seminal recording, and most people are going to know this as the Coltrane Two Tenors record, but Hope was friends with Monk, friends with Powell. They inspired and innovated and drove each other. And this is just already this impressive lineage of players. Randy Weston, New York piano player. He is one of the guys that really embraced African sounds, multiculturalism, world music. He, along with Yusuf Lateef, are the two guys that kind of really start to incorporate world sounds into jazz in the 50s. And where better to do that than New York City? The pulsing, pounding sensation of being in New York, surrounded by diversity at every turn. Let me see if I can plop some of those sounds into what I'm doing. And Weston's a great leader, a great player, and an underappreciated name in jazz. Herbie Nichols. Caribbean descent. I believe his parents were, I just did an episode, was it Trinidadian? Was it Jamaican? I can't recall right now. But also Nichols was a friend of Monk, a strong New Yorker, a great player, a guy that hounded Alfred Lyon to record him, and Alfred finally conceded in the early 50s. And he's just a fantastic player. He organizes the keys in a very neat and efficient way. New York somehow is contributing to this. New York says, I don't think just playing a monotone instrument is going to be enough for me to express the broadness of what I have to say. And so therefore, they all seem to end up on the piano. And it'd be one thing if you could make this same list of great saxophone players, trumpet players, all the other instruments from New York. But that's not the case. There's a kind of dearth of great horn players from New York, which is astounding, but there's not a lot. And yet the piano, it just seems to be this omnipresent thing. I just talked about this record the other day in my Throat Grabber series, and as I did it, I'm like, oh yeah, Kenny Drew's a New Yorker too, isn't he? Sure enough, he is. And Drew ends up going to Europe for a long time, but to me, his sound here is quintessential New York. The hustle, the bustle, the undercurrent. You know, the subways have an undercurrent. You can feel them rumbling under your feet. This is one of the greatest records ever made on Blue Note. It's just a fantastic record. Hubbard and Mobley are outstanding, and the thunder laid down by that rhythm section is pretty unrivaled. Mal Waldron, another guy who does a lot of stuff for the Prestige label and led a lot of sessions and does a lot of work as a sideman. Another New Yorker. And it just, like I said, it just seems as though the streets and avenues of this great metropolis seem to connect with the 88 keys of the piano. If you're from Canton, Ohio, if you're from Cleveland, If you from Kansas City, you don't got 88 streets, numbered, squared up, with little black key alleyways running in between. The scope of 88 streets, numbered and block by block squared in rhythmic formation, waiting for you to make chords out of those streets. That doesn't really exist in any other city. Even Chicago, as big as it was, its streets are kind of running in multi-directions. Milwaukee runs kind of northwest. Clark kind of zigzags its way. Broadway, Northern kind of runs straight west. It's the streets of Chicago aren't the grid of Manhattan. And the cacophony and chaos of a horn player comes out of that crazy dichotomy of that crazy urbanity. And yet New York, for all of its chaos, has a very structured rhythm to it. Bill Evans. This is another guy. As I made my episode about him recently, I had forgotten that he was a New Jersey native. And if you're a New Jersey native, you're either from Philly, New Jersey, or you're from New York, New Jersey. And he's from New York, New Jersey. He's from the northern part of the state. And you didn't get work as a jazz musician, going to school, as a player, recording in Brunswick. You could get some work in Newark. Savoy was in Newark. But for the most part, you took the train into Manhattan. So even though he's in New Jersey, just like Basie, New York is still the center of that universe. And you're a New Yorker when you live in northern New Jersey, just like you are when you live in western Connecticut. You're a part of the tri-state area. That's the metropolitan 20 million people strong. And the impact of New York, it just seems to be such an interesting dynamic that I'd be interested to hear other people's takes on this. Number 15 on this list is the great Freddie Redd. And he's most known for this connection, this play that he helped write. And of course, Jackie Mack is on this, if I recall. And he has a couple of nice records at Riverside as well. But again, it just seems to lend a credence to my theory that the organization of the piano and how it can bring organization out of chaos lends itself to the structuring and organization that we're going to do here on this piano. And like I said, there's probably also that economic nudging of, I got bills to pay, my rent's high here in the East Village, in Harlem, wherever you live. New York costs more than any other place to live in America. And if you're going to be a vibraphone player, it might be 3 weeks between session calls. But if you're a piano player, there's usually work to be had. And so I think that economic reasoning and just somehow the shape and dynamic of the city itself just led these guys to this instrument. And all the great New York musicians, with the exception of a few, turned out to be piano players. And it's a loose theory. The fact that most of the great names of jazz are in New York are piano players, that's not a theory. Look up the great horn players from New York from the 50s and 60s, even the swing era. There's not this long litany of players. They're coming from the South. They're coming from the industrial heartland, from that first migration north. And it does seem like New York was a secondary migration. You came from the South to St. Louis, to Detroit, to Chicago, and then you eventually went to New York. Your parents moved to Detroit in 1926, and then when I was 14, I moved to New York. When I was 24, I went to, and all the great jazz players went to New York at some point in their career. All of them. It's so the center of the entire industry that it's inescapable. got to go to New York for work, for playing, for recording, for fame, to be somebody. You know, Armstrong follows that trajectory from the South to Chicago to New York. But the guys who were born in New York City, they seem to end up playing the keys, baby. Those 88. Those tasteful 88. And there's no greater place of structure in jazz. And even a lot of the great other players in jazz, like Mingus, like Dizzy Gillespie, they were piano players as well. And really often great players as well. The piano has a structure and an organization to it that makes it easiest to teach. And so, again, it's just something I came across doing my episodes. And as that list grew, it became more and more kind of phenomenal and more significant. And I'm welcome to hearing your guys' suggestions as to what is it that makes the New York-born jazz musician end up on the piano. What do you got for me? Let me know. This is the Jazz Journal. I'm Dan the Jazz Shepherd. I appreciate you all for being part of my Patreon page. I hope you enjoyed this content. Again, I'm going to try to give a special episode on this channel and every Jazz Journal for you guys to soak in. And I'll probably share it with YouTube eventually, but this is for you guys first. So again, appreciate you. Blessings. Love to everybody. Y'all have a great day. Peace.